So, welcome to All Things Quiz, the 2025 World Quiz Champion, Daoud Jackson.
Fantastic to be here, Gareth.
Congratulations, Daoud. I mean, it's been a week as we record this since you won. The dust has settled a bit. How does it feel now to have achieved this thing that you've been after for a good few years?
It's quite an odd feeling, I guess. The actual day itself and the process is quite drawn out. I think, especially doing it in the UK versus doing it in the US, so you don't really know exactly where you stand. And I think we were pretty early on in the day, as it were. So it's still a bit of an odd feeling, and I don't think that really it'll sort of sink in properly until maybe like the next big in-person quiz where you see a lot of people and then you get a sense of just like what it's like in the room. But yeah, no, it's very exciting.
I mean, you came second last year. Is this a weight off your shoulders, thinking, okay, I was nearly there, or now do you feel there's kind of more pressure because now you're the person to beat?
No, I think definitely the first of those. I think that it's interesting because you get a lot of people saying, it's inevitable or you're definitely going to win or when you come second. But if you look back, there are people who came second and never won. And I think that it's probably less, I think relief is a big factor in it in a way because it sort of means that if you wanted to stop or you want to step back or whatever, you feel like you've got to that point and you sort of capitalized on the momentum that you have. Whereas I think if you had always been very close, then there's a bit more pressure in a way to finally get over the line. So I think definitely in the relief category.
Yeah. Um, you took to the WQC like a duck to water. Looking back at the records, you first did it in 2016 and came 47th. That's the first time of doing it. I believe you were still a student at the time. Um, how does somebody who's still at university kind of jump into the WQC arena and do so well straight off the bat? What was kind of behind your success there?
Yeah, I can still remember doing that first one. I think it was in Northampton. And I think that when you look back on it, the thing that's probably the most different or the most surprising is just sort of like how blind you are coming into the quiz. Whereas now, when I do it, I feel like I understand sort of where the questions are coming from or the whole quiz or sort of the ambience or what to expect. Whereas those early ones, you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but it's still like very baffling, I guess is the word, or like the whole world of what the quiz is and um how to do it and the timings and all of that is a mystery to you a bit. Well, I think in 2016 probably was, yeah, I think at that point I'd been doing quiz for a couple of years, but it was student quiz bowl type stuff. So it was very much on the academic side of things. So there were a few other quizzes, and I guess I had interest in the lowbrow bit, but it was definitely on the academic side of things. And so that was definitely the biggest strength. And I mean, I haven't looked back at the scores. It's probably, if you look back, it'll be heavily tilted towards the highbrow side of things.
But we're seeing now quite a lot of the UK quiz bowlers come through and doing very well at a young age, and obviously Americans, a lot of the top players did quiz bowl in their younger years. Do you see a big crossover between the curriculum that you need to be successful in quiz bowl and the curriculum in the WQC?
I think there's a decent crossover, but I think there are some differences. I think one of the big differences is that Quiz Bowl definitely encourages you to specialize, especially in like a team atmosphere. So for a lot of people, there's not the same incentive to be even rounded within the highbrow. Like there's people who will just know science or people who just know literature or whatever. And so there's a difference there. And I think the style of cluing and the depth is completely different. So there's nothing in this sort of quiz that really matches like Quiz Bowl literature toss-ups, but maybe a bit more the bonuses. So you don't need to know the plots of lots of books really for WQC. So I think there's a difference in that. But I think the biggest difference probably is just in like the speed and the intensity with which stuff moves, and then also probably a bit the understanding of the game. So I think with Quiz Bowl, if you think about like a day of Quiz Bowl, you might be often you're playing about 8 hours of content. That's a huge amount of like pure text to go through. Whereas you can read through or you could play through like a WQC for the most part in an hour, the whole thing. Like you could read the quiz and basically do the whole quiz in an hour. So it's like 8 hours of content in that time. And every year, if people are producing, at a high school level, it's a huge number, but at a collegiate level, it's probably like 10 quizzes that people are going through. The whole canon and the speed with which things move and which people learn new things is really fast. And I think that's probably partly where you get the benefit from it. It's just like this speed of learning things, the speed of things moving on, and also just the process of like really drilling certain things into people. So there's a certain point where people really have this depth of understanding, but also, they're used to things just washing over them time and time again. So you get that speed. Whereas in these sort of quizzes, because the depth of content is less, or you're doing literally fewer questions, then you might be waiting years for something to come up, and you don't have that same sort of canonicity. So it's a different experience, but I think it definitely helps people.
And talking of things that may or may not have helped you, the kind of COVID era explosion of online quizzing. Obviously, you've been really involved in some of the key things in that with Mimi as well,
Yeah.
QB League, so kind of from an administrator point of things, but also the amount of quiz available to players that benefited you, do you think?
I think playing quiz definitely helps. I think for people at home or watching, one of the biggest things is just trying to make quiz coherent. So like now, if I think about 2016 or I think about the past and I think about trying to do this quiz, if it isn't coherent to you, it's very hard to do well. So I think that like coherentizing things is really at the center of stuff. And that's like when you're going through this paper, trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand why they're asking these questions or how they're asking these questions is really key. And that's where writing questions and doing lots of quizzes is really helpful. So when you're writing questions, then you're going through the same process that the writer might be going through. You're saying, okay, I'm trying to think about how do I write a quiz question about Malawi or whatever through, we were doing them as well for a long time. And then that process, you're going, okay, you go through all of these variations and you think about things in the same way as people do. And so that helps you to get into the mindset of like, okay, when I see this question, I can understand what they're trying to ask. I understand how it's going on. And so I think it helps from that mental perspective, as well as obviously the practical perspective of like, if you've written 10,000 questions, then, you've written some of these questions before, you've had the same thought process. So I think that's part of it. And then I think in terms of playing online quiz, obviously that helps. The amount of quiz that people can play now is very high. And I think that if you look back to the last 10 years or the pre-pandemic era, a lot of these quizzes existed a bit more in a wilderness. And WQC is different from anything else in a way. But the more quizzes there are, the more fleshed out things are, and the more you start to get a sense of canon, or you start to get a sense of what should come up frequently and what should come up less frequently. And so the whole thing becomes a bit more fluid in that sense.
Yeah, and for you, the last 5 years, you've been ever present in the top 10 in the world. You broke through in 2021, and from having been 14th, so it's not like you came from nowhere.
Oh, no.
But yeah, last 5 years, particularly that COVID era, you've done very well. Last year in WQC, you were 5 points behind Victoria. This year, you were 5 points ahead. You've had an incredible sort of 12, 18 months, winning the Quiz Olympiad, winning lots of different competitions, Brain of London, the OQL World Championship, buzzer quizzes, all sorts of things. But when it comes to moving from second in the world to first in the world and that kind of switch, did the Olympiad help to give you belief, beating people in the room that you knew you needed to beat in the WQC?
Yeah, I think a bit. I think part of it is probably just when well, I guess there's two things. I think one thing is probably over a period of years, if you've been in and around that point, then you know that you can beat basically almost all of these people. So you're in the mindset where you go, okay, I've beaten so and so in a quiz, or I've beaten so and so in a certain point in time. And so from that perspective, you sort of have the feeling that you can beat people. But I think it's probably a bit more when you go, okay, now I know that I can actually do the whole process. I can win, see it from start to finish. That's probably, there is a difference in that, and just getting over the line. But I don't think that in terms of like, when did I think that I could win? It's probably been like that for a while, just in terms of understanding. And I think that a lot of that is just like looking through what people get or how you do and whatever, and saying, okay, I can see that I'm this many points behind, and is it possible, or can I understand like how you could get another 10 points on this quiz?
Mm.
And if you can, then I think it's not too difficult a process. I think that the difference as well is that with the Olympiad is everybody's on the stage, everybody's in one place, so you have a different atmosphere of like, okay, I can actually see these people, and yeah, it's a bit. It can definitely be daunting, but I think it's also, over time, I think I've probably been in the final in the like EQC thing a couple of times, and then you get used to it, and you sort of see, okay, I'm in, you can control your heart rate a bit and be in the zone when you're doing these quizzes in the right way. So it is a process as that are getting used to it, and I think it does take time to just get over the hump, as it were.
You said an interesting thing on Facebook. I'm going to quote you now. They say defense wins championships, and I think the key was less getting unbelievable answers and more just all-round solidity, getting over 70% in each category. And I looked at your kind of this year versus last year, and last year you were about 69%. This year, about 78% of kind of across the WQC paper, and you improved your genres in 6 out of 8 of the genres. Particularly, I think it was entertainment. You went from a 14, which I don't think is typical for you last year, but to 22 this year, and that's a huge kind of improvement. And culture, you went from 19 to 22. So I think clearly something really worked just in general. It wasn't just make no errors. You clearly had been sort of working and focusing on it. How did you take that or change that position of 69% to 78% in a year?
So I think with the entertainment, I think if you look at the previous year's quiz, there are a lot of things that were just like nonsense that they put in the quiz. Like they just wrote some crap questions that no one knew the answer to from asking other people. So I think that's one of the things is like the last year's one was very hard, the entertainment or whatever. So I sort of put it to the side a bit, but I think more generally it's like a continual process of thinking about what you don't know and focusing on the weaknesses. And that's sort of how I guess I would think about things. And that's where like team quizzes and the team quiz dynamic is big in a way. Because over a period of time, when you're doing a team quiz and you say, okay, I don't know that, like gauging people's response or somebody saying, okay, this is famous. And, quite often if you ask quizzes and they say, oh, yeah, this is really famous, you got to know this. It's not actually famous. It's actually very difficult. But you sort of just like get that understanding of what you should know. And you sort of go, okay, wow, I don't know this. And everyone seems to know it. So then you pay a bit more attention to that. So I think probably part of it's that, and part of it over time is like from a learning perspective, like focusing on your weaknesses over time. And I think that that's probably one of the characteristics of people who do really well, but it also requires a certain sort of determination, as it were, to an interest to basically sit down and learn lots of things that you might not be very interested in. So, like, I'm not really a pop music fanatic, but over time, I probably have learned lots and lots of pop music trivia. And part of that is like a certain sort of dedication where you're actually going to sit down and say, okay, yeah, I'm just going to go and stick to this and really try and fill in those gaps. So I think in terms of the defensive aspect of things, if you think about it in like, okay, the subjects are sort of a pyramid or a cone or whatever, and at the base there are a small number of easy things, and then it expands and gets bigger and bigger. The shape for different subjects is different because in some cases there's millions of different very hard things you can ask about. If it's film or whatever, it gets very big very quickly. But in some areas there's less stuff. And I think that part of what you're trying to do is say, okay, if I want to get to the next level in knowing about this topic, if I want to get the next 3 or 4 points in a category where I already know a lot, the number of things I might need to learn might be thousands of things. Whereas in a subject where I know less, I'm a bit further down the cone. So getting up that little bit more, you don't need to learn as many things. So there's an efficiency thing to that as well. But I think also it comes over time with just like coming back to the writing and whatever. If you're writing quizzes and you're trying to write stuff that you don't like or you don't know about, then you're naturally going to be filling in those gaps and trying to make those other areas ones where you have at least the understanding of what's going on. So yeah, I think it's a gradual process, but I think definitely focusing on the weaknesses is a key.
Absolutely. So on the day when the clock starts and you turn over your paper, do you have a particular methodology for how you tackle it? Do you go to your best genres first, or do you just go through it front to back? How do you approach the actual quiz?
So I think on the day, one of the things is that you do have to concentrate for quite a long time. So in general, concentrating for the best part of, let's say you can basically stop concentrating when the second paper finishes, but you're going to have to concentrate at least for an hour in the first paper and an hour in the second paper. But really, you're probably going to have to concentrate for the best part of 3 hours because you're probably not going to like completely stop concentrating in the middle. So 3 hours of concentration. When you go into that process of the day of, okay, you have to think about how much do I want to do the day before, on the day, whatever, so that you have the literal concentration to be able to concentrate for 3 hours. So there are lots of things where you can learn it on the morning or whatever, where you can go through more notes, but you don't want to actually mentally exhaust yourself. So I think that that's the before you turn over the paper, having enough like mental energy to actually sit down and say, okay, I'm going to be able to concentrate for 3 hours because if you look at the end, often I feel like by the end of the paper, people make more mistakes or whatever. So you've got to have the concentration for 3 hours. Then when I turn over the paper, I would say that one of the first things I do now is probably do the worst category first, on the basis that by the time you've gone through all four categories and then you come back to the worst one, then if you get through, let's say, reading the whole paper 2.5 times, which I think is probably about where I get to 2.5, 2 3/4, then you'll have looked at the worst one the most, and you've also got the time between doing that worst one coming back to the worst one again. And that's sort of what I would do, generally speaking, rather than diving into all the ones you want to do. And then if you do it in order and then you do the worst one last, then you would be in a position where when you've got through that first round and you want to go back and check stuff, you want to go back and check the one probably where you've made the most mistakes. And you've just looked at it like 2 minutes ago. So you probably want to have like 10 minutes to come back and then start correcting stuff, let's say.
That's really interesting because that is the opposite of what I do. And now it makes me think about whether I'm doing it right. Because I always think, oh, I want to maximize my score on my best area. But actually, I think you're probably right on reflection in that I tend to make the silliest mistakes on my weakest areas because I haven't perhaps devoted enough time to just making sure I'm not dropping those points. It's your defensive thing again, isn't it? It's about making sure that you are maximizing what in
Yeah.
your weak areas.
Yeah, I would say as well as also like you've got full concentration at the start. You
Mm.
can come out in and do those ones where you don't enjoy it at the start and you go, okay, I've got enthusiasm. Whereas let's say you've done another paper and you're going, okay, you've done well or whatever. It depends sort of how much time you have, but WQC is always a time rush. People will always make time-based mistakes.
Mm.
So trying to do it as efficiently as whatever as possible is important. So I'd say that like if I look at the common theme between the last three written quizzes I've done, which have all been very successful, it's probably been like the error correction's been very good. And that's probably the most distinctive feature where I look at it and I go, okay, is it that I've known lots of things or these setting has really suited me or whatever? Probably not so much. But I'd say that like when I went through the second pass, somebody asked me sort of just how it went, and I looked it up the other day, and I think it was like from the second time I went through the quiz, I corrected 12 things, and then I made one incorrect change. And there are probably about six things where I didn't change it where it was right. And, I thought about changing it. So, like, the second time round was very successful. That was probably one of the key things. And that's partly, the thing with written quiz. Like, you have to use the time to check things. But that's also, to be honest, why a lot of people don't like doing written quizzes because it's not that much fun going back and checking over what you went through already.
Yeah, and then so obviously when you go through your first pass, there are things you put down. You've got you know them, you've got them right, and there'll be things you might look at and think, okay, I haven't got a clue on this. I've never heard about that. But how much is in that middle ground where you have to dredge it up or make an educated guess?
Honestly, loads of stuff. There's a lot of stuff where it's in that realm. I would say, like, I can look through, but I would say there's a very large percentage of things in this WQC where I had heard of it at least, or like I had a sense.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of that stuff. And I think that's sort of the process over time as you get better at correcting errors for a few different reasons. So one part of that process of correcting things or correcting errors is just having more knowledge so that then you can reapproach the question in a different way. So you can go, okay, I have the wrong answer. I'm not sure which way around, Lesotho and Swaziland are. But then because I know other facts about them, then I can sort of go through in my head and go, okay, this makes sense that this one's here because of this whatever reasons. So having more knowledge helps you to correct errors at a certain point because you can actually go through the logic of just trying to work out why something is the case. Whereas if you're trying to just remember a single fact, then that's quite difficult. So I'd say that that's one of the keys with like where you can correct errors is like actually sitting down and saying, okay, let me think about this and like reflecting on a question rather than the pure memory thing. Now, some of that is, I don't think that it's that helpful to spend the time really trying to remember words, like just trying to actually pull what the word is to mind. And often I guess I don't spend that much time doing that. Maybe that's because um, from a prep side or whatever, I don't have that many times where I'm like trying to purely remember the word, although there are some. But I think probably it's not that useful to spend 10 minutes trying to remember the word. Is like move on, come back to it. Maybe it comes to you, maybe it doesn't, but it's not a great use of your time.
Yeah, time management is so critical, isn't it? In the quiz, and that's where I found this year particularly that first half I found quite friendly. Therefore, I had enough time to spend on the things where I did need to make those educated guesses or connect things together, contextual information. Second half I found harder, didn't have that time, and missed things that I could have got just because I just didn't have the time to ponder on them. So
Yeah.
a lot comes down to that
The
time
second half
management.
has more of the puzzly questions for sure.
Mm,
Especially I think World and whatever has more of those ones we have to think through it rather than
mm,
like you know it or you don't type
mm,
questions. So I think trying to be fairly quick as you go through
mm,
is pretty useful. And working out, the questions that you have no hope on and
mm.
just ignoring those more or less is a good idea.
Do you also use your kind of your quiz writer's brain on it at times, thinking, okay, this is constructed in this way? Because I'll give you an example of where I overthought it. There was a question where I now think it was a typo, where it had a question phrased in one way about a region in Europe, and then phrased kind of flipped the other
Yeah.
way round, the same question. I thought, well, why are those two questions asking the same thing still in that one thing? So I came up with a guess of tautologia. It's like I've never heard of it. It doesn't make any sense. But why are those two things in there? So I overthought that. Presumably, you looked at that and thought, I know the answer, and they've just made a layout error. But do you find yourself overthinking things, or helped by your question writer's brain?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have to try and think through, the why somebody's written this question. And
Mm,
I'd say there's probably one or two where it didn't twig why they've written it. But
mm,
part of that is probably like a reading comprehension type
mm,
task or like a skill, as it were, of just like reading comprehension. But the other thing I would say is that that's also where if you look through the quiz and you go, oh, I went for the wrong answer this many times or whatever, you can always complain about that. But most of the
mm,
time, the solution is just to know more things. And it
mm.
sounds like, it's a patronizing and very unhelpful answer. But
But
it is the solution
fundamentally,
to like cutting through the nonsense, as it were. So
mm,
there's always things in a question where you read it the first time and you misapprehend what they're asking for. And
mm,
then you go, okay, if I actually just know this fact for sure, then I don't need to do the work of trying to work out, which Hungarian painter it is or whatever. Like if you just know the fact cold, then you're in a better position. And I'd say that that's probably a thing where it's like the number of questions that you actually have to juggle, the more you minimize that, the better a position you're in. So sometimes it's
yeah,
like a process of not just learning exactly what it's going to be asked about, but if you know more, the more of these other facts you have, the safer you are in your knowledge of these things. It's very hard to forget things where you have lots of a web of dense connections, but trying to remember just binary associations is quite difficult. So the more you
mm,
know about these things, the more fleshed out they are, the more you're going to make a sensible answer. Like I'm sure, for example, lots of people have tried to learn a list of Chinese provincial capitals, or they know like all these Chinese provinces. The more that you actually know which province is which, or the more fleshed out an idea you have of them, then you're never going to, then, there's like mistakes that are ridiculous to somebody who actually knows which province is which that
mm,
would be quite straightforward to make if you've just learnt the list. If you're trying
mm,
to distinguish between Hebei and Henan or whatever, if you actually
mm,
know which is which, then you have logic, you have reason to say that. Whereas if you're operating on a level where you've just memorized this list and then you spend the time trying to work out which is which or which way you remembered it, then you're in a much more difficult position. So it's like actually quite often the solution to playing better is just to know more things. And then you can sort of provide yourself with the guardrails to stop yourself making silly mistakes.
So, and we'll dive into that in our follow-up video because I think that's really interesting how you get that knowledge in. One of our Patreons has Tomasz from Poland has said you scored 187 points. Do you think you could get to 200 points? You know, so it kind of plays to the what was left on the table. Were there more points available to you? Presumably, you've looked through the paper and kind of worked out what your theoretical maximum might have been. Would
Um,
200 be achievable?
yep. Uh, I mean, definitely. Yeah, honestly, like if I look at let's say the 20 easiest things that I didn't get, then I think getting 13 of those is definitely possible. Yeah,
Mhm.
somebody
But
could
then
have
it's the
got.
things like the time pressure that come in as well, which kind of force those errors, presumably.
Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think that the aim is to get 100% of everything
Mm,
right. It's not to be like completely perfect on
mm,
every single thing that you could plausibly have known. Yeah, I think there's some things where it's like categorical or like to do with the prep or whatever, where I got things where I could have prepared in the right way and got it right. So I think it's definitely possible to get 200. I think this quiz didn't have many questions which were, I would say were impossible. So probably about 10 questions, maybe even less, maybe like 8 to 10 questions where I think basically no one could get the answer right, maybe even less than that, maybe like 7 or 8. So it was one of the papers over time where it's been more reasonable, basically speaking. So I think somebody could have got probably about 205, 206, probably about the theoretical maximum, allowing for some percentage of errors. Like I think if you wanted to say, realistically speaking, getting performance wise more than about 95% is not that reasonable. And it's probably not a good use of your time to go the extra step from 90 to 95%, let's say, of retention of what things you know. So probably, yeah, probably you could get about 90% of things and know
mm.
that number. So yeah, probably somebody could have got about 210, 205,
Wow. So
210.
So there's a law of diminishing returns once you've kind of fished out what you can, and you're wasting time on other things. Were there
Yeah.
um, any answers that you got which were particularly pleasing to you that you kind of felt rewarded specific work, or you just made some connections and you just came away feeling, "Oh, I'm really pleased with that get."
I think probably there were a few where I was like, okay, this is a good answer. The John Taylor one, that was something I think I'd just seen sporadically, and it came to mind. There are other things where you go, okay, I've tried to learn this and I've deliberately learned this. The Haley Wickenheiser or things like that. So there are quite a lot of things, to be honest, where you go over the quiz and you're pleased to remember them. But it's sort of funny as like also you always focus. I don't think too much about the things I got right. I definitely think more or like have spent more time thinking about the things I got wrong. So it's partly the mentality, right?
Well, yeah, I don't think you're
There
alone
are a
in
few.
that. Were there any ones where you're still kicking yourself over them?
Oh yeah, that was a really bad one. I mean there are some where it's easy and you misapprehend what's going on. But there was like I think it was probably question 27 or 28 of the culture paper, so like near the start of the quiz. And it was asking for a Japanese artist. And I realized like I'd seen this picture before because there's an exhibition of
Coming up in
them.
London, isn't there? Yeah.
I can see it from the office. And so in my head, uh, I went to the office on Tuesday and I was like, okay, it's not nearly as big as I remembered it being this poster, but I could see this poster in my head. And I was like, it was sort of getting bigger and bigger in my head, like the sort of the eyes in The Great Gatsby. Uh, I was just like, or I could, in my head, I was like, this is the only thing I'll be able to see from the office. This poster of just like this name, but I never heard of the artist or never thought about it, like fully comprehended it. So I think I wrote Hara and it's Nara. So they're both like quite common Japanese surnames. So I sort of remembered it, but I was like, oh, I'm just gonna get this wrong, and then I'll be very annoyed sitting in the office for like
Yeah.
a week just or like probably months. It's just about to open this exhibition. So it probably would have been like 3 months where I was like booking desks looking away from that sign. Uh,
Well, it's a good job you didn't lose by 1 point because that would have just been haunting you every day you went into work.
yeah, it felt like too haunting. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm probably going to lose by one because this is just like such perfect, haunting material that losing by one would make sense in this case. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's just like there are things you remember or things you don't quite tweak. If I look at the things that were the hardest, some of these are things where, there are things that I just know that I'm surprised that more people didn't know, like Serge Gnabry or whatever. Like that's the sort of thing where it probably doesn't come up enough in quizzes, like quote unquote normal football questions.
Mm.
I'm a big advocate that there should be probably a lot more football questions. Like I think for a 30 question quiz, probably at least four, maybe even like five, six football questions, given that it's by far the most popular sport in the world, and it has all these different facets to it. So that's the sort of thing where I go, okay, other people don't have the same engagement, but I'm sort of surprised that more people didn't know that. But then when I look at things where just from looking at the spreadsheet, like there are some things where you remember things that you got wrong in a previous quiz. So there was the Chinese mythical emperor who's like a agriculture god as well, which is Shenlong. And I can remember trying to learn lots of Chinese emperors before we went to ACF Nationals, which is a big like American quiz bowl tournament. And that was probably like the best part of 10 years ago. And I remember like writing it down or like semi learning these clues. And there was a question on it in a tiebreaker game, which we lost. And I just couldn't remember it for the life of me. I spent the whole time being like, oh my God, I actually can't remember this stupid answer. And so I just spent the whole time like sitting there thinking about it. I remember it and just being annoyed because we lost the game by like it would have made the difference. So it's quite satisfying to get that sort of answer where you go, okay, over time these things get drummed into you, and the sort of negative emotion of remembering things that you got wrong can actually be quite a helpful process in that regard.
If you had one tip for a new quizzer who wanted to start on the road to being a world champion, what would that be?
I think probably just go back through the things you got wrong on every quiz. Like I'll go back through, I'll say, I went through just after the quiz with two colored pens, and I said these are the things that I got wrong, and these are the things that I didn't know. And you can look at those and say, okay, what do I need to do differently? Like, did I make a lot of mistakes? So I would say, like, I think when I did the quiz, there were 17 things that I got wrong where I would plausibly say that I knew it. So I got 91, 92% of things right, which is pretty good. I think that's good enough to win. I think that's probably a bit over. I think you probably need to be about 90. And on, flashcard apps or whatever, you can set your desired retention to be about 90. And it's probably that's about a good mark. You don't want it to be 100 because the return scale will be quite bad. So I think if you say, okay, am I remembering enough of the stuff that I do know? And then if you say, okay, but for most people, the case will be that you get a certain percentage of what you do know, and then the stuff that you don't know is much bigger. And then go through those and say, okay, how could I know it? Or why have they asked this? Or what's the sort of logic behind this question? And just understand the quiz. So, it's like, it doesn't have to be that you just learn unitary facts, but just try and think through the quiz in a coherent way. And when the whole thing makes sense, like concretely, you have a coherent understanding of what's going on, then I think you're in a much better place. So just trying to feel comfortable. And I think that's part of it with all these quizzes is just like when you feel comfortable, then you'll be in a good place to perform well. When a lot of things are still baffling to you and you go, I have no idea why they're asking this. I don't know what this is. Then you're in a bad place. So even if you don't know the answer, if you can say, I understand why they're asking this or what sort of thing this is, then you're in a good position.
Brilliant. Well, thanks so much for your time, Daoud. It's been really interesting hearing your thoughts and hearing kind of your process and your background. What ambitions remain for you at this point?
Yeah, it's funny because I guess I've won a lot of the big quizzes that I wanted to win, and I hadn't really won any of them before, so I was sort of a bit of the eternal second. So I'd come second in like the EQC Quiz Olympiad. I'd come second in WQC. I'd come second in BQC. I've been in the final of Bowl before and not won. So, like, of those quizzes, I'd come second in basically all of them before. and then I've won quite a few of them now. So I think probably one of the things that would be nice is like with the team quizzes to just be, really in a strong position with those. And that's probably partly also like a mental shift from being more focused on correcting errors and learning the easiest things to trying to learn a few more of the hard things. And I find that that's a more satisfying process as well because you can learn your strengths rather than just learning your weaknesses. Like if I went to go and say, okay, what's the best thing for me to learn right now? It would probably be go and learn more pop music trivia, which I would probably find at least slightly tiresome. So it would be quite interesting to do more team quizzes. But then I think, as well as that stuff on an individual level, probably more just like trying to build a better quiz ecosystem. And obviously, I've done like a certain amount of organizing in the past. So to me, it would probably be trying to like organize some quizzes where there's a better outreach, especially in the UK. I think that the like overall structure is not that good on like the outside bit of the funnel. There's like a disconnection between the number of people who do quizzes completely casually and then people who do quizzes very seriously. And there's like a missing link basically between that. So I'd be quite interested to see and to work with people to just like create the right structure to just like bridge that gap between, that stuff. So organizing stuff, writing stuff, all of those are things that I'm interested in doing, as well as just like, continuing to churn out the wins. But yeah, I'm very grateful for just being in the position where you can reflect on these things and say, you've done well, but definitely not resting on laurels or saying, here's 10 years of winning all these quizzes. A lot of it, there is some element of luck or process or whatever that you get into. And so you can be in a position where you say, okay, I've done really well. I'm really happy with how I've done. But it might be that, you have a few years of just being unlucky or coming second or whatever. So each win, is to be cherished in that sense.
And that's a great note to finish on. Daoud Jackson, congratulations on becoming world champion. Enjoy the year ahead. And thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thanks so much, Gareth. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to our Patreon members for their support in making this video. One of the benefits of supporting All Things Quiz as a Patreon member is that you get to send us questions that we pose to people like Daoud Jackson. You can join our Patreon at patreon.com/allthingsquiz from £3 a month.